You've tuned into Radio Northern Beaches. We live stream on rnb.org.au across the northern beaches of New South Wales, Australia and all over the world. You can also catch us local on 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Our podcasts are available at your convenience at rnb.org.au or rnbpodcast.com. So you and your friends don't miss any episodes. Don't forget to follow and share. Now here's our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. I'm Michael Lester. Our program is Community Voices. If you enjoy these in-depth 30-minute conversations with people who know what they're talking about interesting issues of interest to our community and more generally, you can find an archive of hundreds of these discussions if you just Google Michael Lester Mixcloud. We also send out podcasts on all the platforms, Spotify and all the rest of him, if you Google Radio Northern Beaches podcasts. Our topic today is media and religion. Our national public broadcaster, the ABC, has for over 100 years now been programming religious material and content. I guess over that time there have been many, many changes in the environment and setting within which this programming takes place, both in media and in religion. We're grateful to have with us on the line the very experienced ABC reporter, journalist who has for many years been with the ABC on domestic and international affairs. These days he's presenting a program on religion by the title God Forbid. I'm talking about James Carleton. And as I say, I'm delighted to welcome you, James, to Radio Northern Beaches.
Delighted to be with you, Michael.
In terms of the context over this 100 years that I've mentioned, there must have been a lot of changes within the ABC about its attitudes and its programming of religious matter. How would you characterise the sort of changes? For example, in only recent years, they had to chop out the religious unit and religious programming, which was there, the religion report. And where are they at the moment?
They did briefly axe the religion and ethics report. You're quite right, Michael, but there was such an outcry that in time it was reinstated, which I'm pleased to say because it's an excellent program presented by Andrew West, my sister program. But if you wanted an example of how much the ABC's coverage of religion has changed, as you say, when it began in ABC Radio, we're talking 100 years ago, they used to broadcast church services, and this continued well into the post-war era. Imagine that today, your ABC coming to you live from St. Mary's. It doesn't happen anymore.
Didn't the administration used to be called the religious unit, just like you had a science unit, which incidentally was axed too, I believe, and severely cut back at the same time as a speciality unit? Isn't it now known as religion and ethics? And what's the significance of this pairing of religion and ethics rather than religious unit?
They did was expanded the brief to cover religion when it would have been both a unit that journalistically reported on the topic of religion, for example, the news that an archbishop is being appointed, in addition to religious programming, by which I mean broadcasting of church services. We gradually stopped broadcasting explicitly religious services. It was deemed that it was no longer the ABC's role to, facilitate religion in this way, bearing in mind, of course, we were talking about the major Christian denominations at the time. Now Australian religion, indeed it always has been, but particularly in the post-war period, Australian religion is so diverse, it simply wouldn't be possible to cover all the religions from a proselytizing perspective. It wouldn't be desirable either. But to get to your question, having approached it from a roundabout way, is we expanded our coverage from religion news, as distinct from religion proselytizing, to also ethics news. This is a far broader brief. It was to cover what you might call in the census the nuns. That is not women in the Roman Catholic Church, but is people who select no religion on the census, but may have some spiritual or agnostic or quest for meaning in their life that doesn't fit within the normal category of Catholic or Anglican, Jewish or Muslim. So there is this cohort of Australians who do have an interest in questions of meaning and purpose, but don't fit neatly within the old religion denominational categories, the institutional religious categories. And for that reason, the ABC says it broadened and expanded its brief from the religion unit to the religion and ethics unit. Now, that was not without controversy.
It might be interesting to hear about what controversy that engendered.
Well, you see, the priests at the time and the cardinals and the bishops of the Christian denominations were worried that, well, hang on, if you expand religion to religion and ethics, you're kind of secularizing the topic. And indeed, they would say, what is ethics without religion? There's an argument that says, what's the point of being a good person in the modern world unless there are some eternal reasons and consequences, heaven and hell, to put it simply. The idea was that even in our secular Australia, our ideas, the clergy would have you believe, our ideas of good and bad are foundationally based on religious ideas, religious ethics, be they the Ten Commandments or otherwise. And there's no escaping that, they would say. Therefore, the expansion of religious coverage to so-called ethical coverage is a weakening of, or a dilution or a diminution of the coverage of religion in Australia, and therefore is to be resisted, to be opposed. It's the similar argument to what was made, in schools in New South Wales. They did in fact introduce ethics classes that would be in the time of the school day where there was religion and scripture classes. Kids who wanted to, whose parents allowed them, would go and get religious instruction for an hour a week from an Anglican, from a Muslim, from a Jew, from a Uniting Church person. And kids whose parents didn't want them having religious scriptural instruction would just have supervised learning where they would read books, say, without any class. The Labor government at the time wanted to say, no, well, why don't we bring in actual ethics classes when the other religious kids are going to religious scripture classes? Again, the churches opposed that. They said, no, this will draw away from our classes. You can't have ethics without religion, or at least you can't fully understand it without understanding the role religion has had to play in the development of ethics. This is an argument, as I say, made by some, not all, in the church. And just as they didn't want ethics in the classroom, that is to say, ethics without religion, they didn't want ethics without religion on the ABC either. But it did come about, and we now have a unit, which I'm a part of, which covers the broad gamut of topics that might be, included under the umbrella of religion and ethics, which can be anything from spirituality to how one finds meaning and purpose in life to what makes up a good life, or, questions around what is goodness and badness, are good people, you're really unlimited in the number of topics you can explore.
This does go to the underlying question, perhaps, or an underlying question about what is the role of a public broadcaster in regard to religious content, news and matter. For example, I understand that in the UK and the BBC, the public broadcaster, because presumably there is an established state religion there, that they're still putting out a lot of religious material and in the sense of even, I believe, church services. Whereas, of course, in America, the approach is very, very different, and it's much more diverse and typically takes place in commercial media. What is the role here of the public broadcaster in our setting here, a secular society, a multicultural society? You can have a range of roles, can't you? Education, evangelism, interfaith dialogue, cultural reflection, and even investigative and scandalous material. Does the public broadcaster have any particular role and responsibility in this context here today?
Well, you're right, Michael, to point out the sort of bookends, the extremes of Britain and America, and Australia lies somewhere in the middle. We're obliged under the ABC Act and Charter to provide a comprehensive coverage, not to supplement or complement what the commercial sector does, but to provide a comprehensive output in our own right. Whether or not we succeed in that at the ABC is a question for Australians generally. But that's what the idea is. And that includes religion, as it also includes science and sport and parliamentary current affairs and news and so on and so forth. quite distinct from the American experience, where despite the intense religiosity of America, if, say, for example, the PBS, the public broadcasting service, were to do religious programming, it would be unconstitutional. It not just wouldn't be not allowed, it would be in contravention of the US Constitution. They have an extremely high wall separating church and state, and the PBS gets some public money, not much, but some. ABC, of course, fully funded by the taxpayer, by the government. But we don't have that high wall separating church and state. We're a secular country, but not, it's a blended secularism. It's a soft secularism, not like the hard secularism of the US. And people have difficulty getting their heads around how that works, because they see in America such extreme religiosity expressed by the people. They see TV evangelists, you touched on it, or religion on TV, whereby you'll have priests giving these sermons on Christian TV saying, give your money now so you can go to heaven. It seems crazy. But of course, that's private television. It's not even broadcast television, licensed television. So they're completely free to do whatever they like. It's the intersection of the Amendment of Free Speech and also the US Constitution, which requires the hard separation of church and state. And then you made the other point of the contrast of England, United Kingdom, which of course goes the complete other way, which not only enmeshes the religion with the state, but indeed picks a religion, the Church of England. It is the established church. And as a result of that, the BBC, yes, indeed, does broadcast church services in the way that the ABC used to do it. Funny thing is, the ABC used to, back when Australia was a sectarian kind of place where there was tension between our Catholic and Protestant communities, the Catholics would get a bit of a foothold in ABC News, whereas the Protestants would get something of a stronghold in other divisions of the ABC. And you could see the tensions playing out in this way. All of that's thankfully gone now. We don't have this sectarian conflict anymore.
Well, we're in conversation here on Radio Northern Beaches, our program Community Voices, with James Carleton, a journalist, broadcaster, presenter with the ABC, and particularly about his program that he is running these days and has been for some time, God Forbid, with religious content. And what is the concept behind your program, which is, I find, completely fascinating, very thought-provoking? I wonder what the idea is, not least the title.
A manager came up with the title because it's kind of catchy, God forbid, which used to be an expression in far more popular use, God forbid that should happen, heaven forfend. I tried to explain to the manager, who wasn't particularly religious, that it's a little bit blasphemous because if one's devout in their religiosity, many religions ask that you don't take, or indeed demand that you don't take the name of God in vain. Therefore, calling for, saying God forbid is, in the old determination, in any case, blasphemous. But I was not listened to. Look, I'm being flippant, but to answer your serious question is, what is the aim of this show? It is to kind of, in a time when we are so secularized and the attraction of institutional religion is so weak, and attendance at institutional religious services is so minimal, although interesting recent data, this may be changing. That's another conversation for another time. But at a time when religion is intergenerationally and generationally going through a fundamental change, it's no longer the, authority figure that it was. What does this mean for all the questions that religion used to answer, like what is right and wrong? What's my place in the world? Where do I get my sense of community and fellowship? What are the institutions and communities that bind me, that accept me, that exclude me? These questions are all in flux in the 21st century. And into this space, there are millions of Australians who simply don't, how do I put it, who aren't religious and would think that the last place they would rightly turn for answers is institutional religion. Now, there's nothing at all wrong with that. That's, in many cases, a reasoned and reasonable conclusion to draw on the basis of the history of the last century, the cultural history of Australia. But the question then becomes, in this rationalist, humanist, secularist, even atheist world we live in, where do higher questions of purpose and meaning get answered? Now, what I try to do with my program is appeal to people who never in a million years would have thought religion would have had an answer for them. And indeed, I don't seek to dissuade them of that opinion. Institutional religion may not be the answer, but I do try to present to them very often, not always, people of faith who have explored the same questions they're exploring, that is to say, the secularists, the atheists are exploring, simply by virtue of the fact that they're all human beings. Whether we like it or not, all of us long for some understanding of the answer to the question, who are we, what's our place in the universe, and what's the reason for it all? One might come up with a rationalist, a humanist, an atheistic answer to that question, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the question remains, what is the purpose of it all? And that question doesn't get fully answered, one, I find, simply by living in what we might call a new atheist, purely rationalist space. It does for some, and that's perfectly fine, but there is a cohort of people who are searching for meaning, but not searching for formalized institutional religion with all the doctrinal and dogmatic baggage that it comes with, the hypocrisy and so on. And that's the niche that I'm trying to appeal to, or at least trying to introduce. I don't know if I want to use the word faith, but I certainly want to introduce people of faith to that cohort, because if I do that, they'll realize they have so much more in common than they realize. And in doing that, perhaps there's some broader ambition of understanding I can, in some small way, facilitate, which is what I hope to do.
The agenda that you address over the months and years that you've been doing this is really very broad and challenging. I think a motto of your program is nothing off limits, isn't it? And you do seem to range across all these perspectives, whether philosophical, sociological, historical, cultural critiques, theology, rhetoric. You seem to cover so many different perspectives. I'm just wondering, is it any sort of a challenge in any sense to try to identify topics that fit within this framework that you've constructed for this program?
Well, precisely because it is so broad, as you correctly described, that does make it a lot easier. Because if I can't find one topic a week that falls under the gamut of philosophy, history, meaning, politics, goodness, badness, hell, heaven, God, atheism, I shouldn't really be in my job. But having said that, even though it is so broad between you and me, sometimes we do go, what the hell are we going to do this week? But we always find an answer in the end. It mightn't be a good answer, but it's one nonetheless.
I mean, the whole question of what topics you tackle, and it's an incredibly broad range, but it's in a domain that can elicit, certainly has historically, a lot of public reaction, not necessarily always supportive, and controversy. And there's certainly a lot of contemporary issues to do with religion generally that are quite controversial. The ABC, as the national broadcaster that's carrying this, has a responsibility in the charter to be impartial and objective and what have you. To what extent, if any, do you as an individual presenter of these programs face editorial constraints or managerial constraints, either on specific programs you've done? Do you or don't you?
We do have to comply with the editorial guidelines, and one of those guidelines and requirements is impartiality. My relationship with the leadership my leadership at the ABC is very functional, and we collaborate to ensure compliance in that regard very smoothly and very easily. I mean, there is a broader question. What is impartiality? So often it's in the eye of the beholder, I can do a program which will get a complaint from one person saying it's biased towards Christianity, and another person will complain that it's biased against Christianity, just like a political reporter can get a complaint from a Labor supporter and a Liberal supporter about the same story, which isn't to say that the complaints aren't legitimate. It's just to say that it's a contested space. Look, just to give you one example, there's an emerging idea that amongst young people that Jesus was a figure of myth, that he perhaps didn't even exist as a man. So we, as distinct from exist as the Son of God who was resurrected, which is altogether a different claim. We did a story on this, the so-called historicity of Jesus. It'll be coming to air shortly. And we had guests on there who gave attention to the argument that, yes, not only did Jesus exist, but he is God. We had another guest who was a historian who said, yes, Jesus, the evidence overwhelmingly suggests, was a man from Galilee. Jesus of Nazareth, according to the evidence, very likely existed, but whether or not he was, his spiritual claims are just that, questions of faith. But we didn't have a guest on who makes the argument that, no, he did not exist as a man. Why? Because it's pretty much a fringe claim among the academy, amongst people who know what they're talking about, that is to say, ancient historians, not biblical theologians, although they believe it too, but scholars of ancient history, archaeologists and so forth. It's overwhelmingly the view that there was this man who made religious claims, who did walk the land of Palestine 2,000 years ago. Now, were we biased in that we didn't have a person on who said, no, Jesus didn't exist, it's all a myth? This is the question. It's like if we talk about climate science and we don't get someone on who says there is no such thing as anthropomorphic climate change. Humankind has no influence over the climate. Is that biased if we don't have that voice? These are questions I put to your audience, as open questions.
Speaking here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches with James Carleton, presenter for ABC Radio of the Religious Matter and Issues program, God Forbid. James, one of the features, to me anyway, of your program is that typically you feature a panel of people, but it must be a bit of a challenge for you constantly find a path through to inclusivity.
It's always a challenge, but I love it. Whenever I have a program, whenever I have a panel of 3 guests on who have diametrically opposing views, not just about, what the bus timetable should be, but about the most fundamental questions in life, about what is right and what is wrong and what happens when we die. These are big things. And these are things that can drive people to war and have done. And yet it's so exciting and so rewarding for me to get people who disagree at that level doing so respectfully, doing so in a way that sheds light and creates understanding and can also create heat. There's nothing wrong with that, but in a way that does so that people may learn about the other. And when I know I've really got it right, I don't always get it right, but I know I've really got it right. When I get to people with, as I say, completely opposing views who end up laughing together about the things they disagree about. Because we have a lot of fun on the show, Michael, and sometimes there's laughter. A lot of the times there's laughter. And sometimes you have to laugh. I mean, the world is a pretty extraordinary place. And if you're not crying, the only alternative really is laughing, and we do a lot of both.
There's quite an interaction between media and its technology, of course, and religion, its proselytization and its participation and engagement. It works both ways. And these days, although things are very diverse, and particularly in Australia and multicultural, and even the impact of new media on presenting religious issues, in this case on radio or TV. But we've got this proliferation, haven't we, of new media. First of all, the internet and now the social media, where all the voices who wish to be heard on all sorts of aspects of religion, mainstream, fringe or otherwise, have got plenty of voice, which again comes back to the issue of whether this, in a sense, is changing both the nature of religious views and ideas and what sort of impact that has on the work and the medium you operate in.
Yeah, excellent question. And certainly they have things now called religion influencers and spirituality influencers. in social media, TikTok and so on and so forth. People with huge followings, especially amongst younger generations. You ask, what does it mean for places like the ABC? It's bad news for the ABC, by which I mean it's a huge drain on our audiences because we are this siloed legacy mainstream media where we have our science department and our religion department and this linear format of a radio station frequency, although of course we have a big digital and internet online presence, podcast and so on and so forth. But against this, we have competing with us the social media, anyone from around the world. They're not limited by topics. So you can get your Jordan Petersons who don't just cover religion, they cover masculinity, they cover politics, they cover everything. They do it in a format that's appealing. And they can, just to take that one example of Jordan Peterson, can attract followings in the many, many millions of people. And even though he speaks a great deal about religion and Christianity and the place of Christianity and Judeo-Christian heritage in the Western tradition, he expands it to so many other areas of life, everything from gender politics to, Middle East conflict. And he can therefore attract as many people, so many people to his cause, and they follow him with a religious fervor. Meanwhile, little old ABC, I mean, Auntie we're called, it couldn't be a better name. We obviously can't take a religious stance. We can't take a stance really about anything. We're restricted by format. We're restricted by stance. We're restricted by the method of communication, broadcast. We're restricted by audience to Australia. So it really is an existential question that is facing the legacy media. This is, as you know, happening everywhere: newspapers, TV, radio.
Yeah, in the religious domain too, though it's particularly interesting too, as in all domains, because not only does the media technology impact on the domain, but in this case, and the presentation, it can actually change and mutate the actual form, in this case of religion or whatever, in the process. But as we wrap up here with our guest, James Carleton from the ABC, the presenter of the Religious Matters program, God Forbid. James, a last personal question. It used to be thought, and I don't know if it still is, that religion was pretty much a private and personal matter. I wonder how you, presumably with your own set of personal views on these matters and values and beliefs, whether it's any sort of a struggle for you as the presenter, particularly when you've got this diverse range of views you finally decided to give air to, how you handle and navigate this divergence from a personal point of view on air. Is it a challenge or is it easy? Or
it's a paradox because radio is a very intimate medium, as you know. When you broadcast, when you have just the spoken word and you have it over and over again, episode after episode after episode, over years, you build a relationship with the listener. And, we say listener instead of listeners because it is a one-on-one medium, unlike television, which is passive and you're looking at the screen. And it is so intimate that, in a way, over years, over time, the listener and the broadcaster develop an understanding. One gets to know, I just think of all the people I've listened to over decades in radio. I feel I know them, even though I've never met them. So in that way, people know the few that listen to me regularly. I don't want to overstate this, but in that way, people know a lot about me. But again, at the same time, to answer the other question you make, I never reveal anything explicitly about my private presence or absence of faith in my life. It is a challenge because you want to give of yourself, and yet you don't want to give what is not appropriate to give. It's funny. It's also something, one doesn't always have. Perhaps I have less control over than I would like. Again, I use the analogy. Think of someone you know on radio and you've listened to for 20 years. The things you know about them, they probably never wanted you to know, but you know because you know them so well. So in that sense, you say to me, Michael, oh, well, James, do you have trouble controlling what people know about you? Well, maybe that assumes I do control it. Maybe I don't. In other words, maybe far more people know that I'm neurotic than I would like.
Well, let me say that from listening to you, I would never have called you that. So thank you very much, James Carleton, presenter of the ABC Radio National's God Forbid programme, for joining us and speaking so candidly and in such an insightful way about the challenges and opportunities of presenting religious matter and content and issues in this day and age on radio programmes. Thanks very much, James.
My privilege, Michael. Thank you.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.